Starting off our observation, scoop 1 was measured at 0.5. Then going on to scoop 2 was measured at 1. Going on to scoop 3 was 1.75. We noticed that through the first 3 scoops that they increased by 0.5 from scoop 1 to 2, and later going on from 2 to 3, it increased. 4 scoops later, we're now on scoop 8. Scoop 8 was measured at 4.25. Throughout the 4 scoops, we realized that they were still increasing by 0.5. Next, scoop 9. Scoop 9 is at 5.25. Next is scoop 10. Scoop 10 went up to 5.75. We realized that throughout this observation, the scoops went up 0.5 and 0.5 as it increased. On bowl 2, scoop 1 measured 0.75. Next is scoop 2. Scoop 2 measured 1.5. Scoop 3 measured 2. After the first 3 scoops, scoop 1 through 2 had a difference between 0.5, while scoops 2 to 3 had 4 scoops later, we're now on scoop 8. Scoop 8 measured 5.25. Now it's scoop 9. Scoop 9 measured 5.75. Then scoop 10, the last and final scoop, measured 6.25. We realized throughout these observations that there was a pattern between 0.75 and then 0.5. For bowl 3, scoop 1 was at 0.25. Scoop 2 was at 0.75. And scoop 3 was at 1.75. We realized that they went up 0.5, and from 2 to 3 it went up 1 whole point. Scoop 8 measured to be at 5.25. Scoop 9 measured to be at 6, and scoop 10 measured to be at 6.25. In our observation at the beginning, it was going up 0.5, and then it later went up to 0.75 until the very end. From scoop 9 to 10, it went up 0.25. In bowl 4, we picked a plugged funnel. We used a scoop 1/2 cup. So in scoop 1, we measured 2.7. In scoop 2, we measured it to be at 4. On the third scoop, we measured it at 4.5. Four scoops later, we're now at scoop 8. Scoop 8 measured to be 7.25. Now scoop 9. Scoop 9 measured to be 7.75. And the last scoop, scoop 10. Scoop 10 measured to be 8.5. In bowl 4 observation, we measured that from scoop 1 to scoop 2, it was 1.25. And from 2 to scoop 10, it was continuous at 0.5.
Okay, so the very first graph that we're going to show you is the ink bottle, and we matched it with graph G. And as you can see, it starts off as a linear graph until this point, which as you can see, there's an increase in height while there's a decrease in volume. And that's because since at first, when you fill up the ink bottle, there will be the same amount of volume as there is in height on each point. But then, when you get to this point right here, it'll start getting narrower. And when it gets narrow, you start seeing a decrease in volume and an increase in height. Thus, the spike in height and the decrease in volume on graph G. That's why we matched it with graph G. Second is the conical flask. We matched it with graph D, this one, because as you can see, as soon as you start filling it up, it starts to get narrow each time you fill it up. So that's why at first you would see a decrease in height and an increase in volume, but as soon as you start getting to the top, each time you fill it up, you would start to see an increase in height and a decrease in volume. So it would form kind of like a curvature graph, which is why we matched it with D. The third one is the evaporating flask. We matched it with graph I. And the reason for matching it with graph I, which is this one, is because as soon as you start filling up the flask, you would see an increase in height than you would see in volume. Because when you fill it up at the bottom, it's narrow compared to the midsection of the flask right here. So this is more narrow than it is here. So that's why you would see an increase in height and the decrease in volume. But as soon as you start going up and up and up and up, when you start filling it, you would start seeing a decrease in height and an increase in volume. However, when you start filling it up more, there's another curvature over here at the turning point, where it would start to get narrow, just like over here in the bottom. It would start to get more narrow than the mid section of the flask, and you would start seeing an increase in height than an increase in volume. So thus the graph would be at the end would be an increase in height and a decrease in volume. So that's why it's graphed with graph I. Fourth is the bucket, and as you can see, we graphed it with graph A, which is this one. And the reason for graphing it with A is because the bucket is narrow at the bottom than it is at the top, right here. So it's more narrow at the bottom than it is at the top. And the reason for A is because at first you start to see an increase in height and a decrease in volume, but as you start filling it up to the top, you would start to see a decrease in height and an increase in the volume, which is why we graphed it with letter A. And the reason why we didn't do letter B was because each time you would fill the bucket, it would be a constant volume and a constant height that it would increase by. And letter B, you can see that there's a way bigger amount of volume that is filled and a decrease in height to an extent. So that's why we graphed it with letter A. And the vase, we graphed it with letter E because as you fill the flask, it's wide at the bottom, and as you start filling it, it'll start getting narrow in the very midsection of the vase. And then as you fill it up more, it'll start to get wide again. So that's what we got to with letter E. Because as you can see, there is an increase in volume and a decrease in height at the very beginning. But as you start to fill it up more, you can see that there's a increase in height than there is in volume. And then once you start filling it up more, you see that the volume will start to increase, thus the height will decrease. So that's the reasoning behind graphing it with letter E. Then the plunged funnel is the 6th graph, and we graphed it with the letter B. And the reason for that is because, like I said, when you start to fill the funnel, it's narrow at the bottom than it is on the top. At the top, it's very, very wide compared to the bottom. So when you start to fill it, you would see an increase, a dramatic increase in height than you would see in the volume. And as you start to fill it up past the narrow point, right here where it starts to get larger and larger in terms of volume, you would see an increase in volume than you would see in height as the more you fill it up. That's thus the answer being letter B. And that's our matching. And I hope you all like it.